Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict academic webinar series. My name is Jake Fitzpatrick, and I'm the Coordinator of Digital Initiatives at ICNC, and today's presentation will be titled Rethinking Civil Resistance, How to Challenge Power and Build a Democratic Society, and will be delivered by Barry L. Gahn, Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Center for Nonviolence at St. Bonaventure University, and also a member of the ICNC Academic Advisory Committee. Barry L. Gahn is a Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Center for Nonviolence at St. Bonaventure University, and he's also a member of the ICNC Academic Advisory Committee, and he's the author of Violence and Nonviolence, An Introduction. He is a co-editor with Robert L. Holmes of a leading anthology on nonviolence titled Nonviolence in Theory and Practice, which is now in the third edition, and he's the editor of The Acorn, the Journal of the Gandhi King Society. For 2 years, he served as Program Committee Chair of the oldest and largest interfaith peace group in the United States, the Fellowship of Reconciliation. He has taught at St. Bonaventure University for the past 30 years since receiving his MA and PhD degrees in philosophy from the University of Rochester in 1981 and 1984, respectively. Prior to that, he taught high school and junior high school English for 6 years, and he's newly married to Mao Li Zhang, a trainer in microscopic photography for Olympus of China. He has a daughter who is a writer and works at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County, and a son who has recently been graduated from college. And with that, I'd like to let Professor Gahn take over for his presentation.
Jake, thank you very much. I've been told to pause a few seconds between slides to enable time for the audio to catch up. So I'm going to be moving from the title page, Rethinking Civil Resistance, How to Challenge Power and Democratize Societies, to the opening slide. I want to thank you all for joining us here. The concept of civil resistance has manifested itself recently in large-scale demonstrations, such as we see here, as the ultimate means to effect major political change. We've seen this take place with very mixed results in countries such as Serbia, Tunisia, Ukraine, Georgia, Egypt, which we're looking at here, Libya, and Syria, among other places. The focus of many recent resistance movements has been the removal of leaders at the top. In the case of Tunisia, the removal of Ben Ali has been hailed as the success story of the Arab Spring, tempered by some news in the last day or two, for it was followed by what has been called a stable democracy that has, however, seen 2 or 3 governments in the last 4 years, the assassination of 2 opposition leaders, and a notable spike in numbers of Islamic youth traveling from Tunisia to fight for ISIS. In the case of Hosni Mubarak, as we know, the fate of the average Egyptian is no better and perhaps worse than before Mubarak's ouster. Al-Assad's brutal crackdown on nonviolent activists in Syria was returned with violence as the first resort of many opponents to his regime. This undercut any long-term effectiveness of the nonviolent movements in that country. Syria, as we all know, is now in a civil war. Yanukovych's sudden departure from Ukraine, the result of mass uprisings in Kiev, quickly led to what has in essence become a civil war. The logical implications of this approach to political change are not immediately apparent. Ostensibly, they rest on the teachings of Gene Sharp, whose writings had been widely read among activists in all of the countries where we've seen political upheavals in the last 15 years, and before, too. Gene Sharp maintains that power is typically conceived in one of 2 ways, both of which can be represented by this pyramid structure. as a monolithic model and as a pluralist dependency model, which Sharp in recent years has termed the social view of power. Both models view the population of a country or an institution as comprising a pyramid. The monolithic model conceives of power as emanating from the leadership at the top of the pyramid, supported by enforcers such as the police or the army. The social view of power conceives of power as emanating from the obedience, compliance, conformity, or the acceptance of leadership by those at the base of the pyramid. The concept of nonviolent strategic action and of civil resistance rests on the social view of power. It maintains that if the people at the bottom of the pyramid withdraw their obedience, essentially pulling out the bottom of the pyramid, their compliance, if they withdraw their compliance, if they withdraw their acceptance of leadership, then those at the top of the pyramid will fall from power. The pyramid will collapse. But mass demonstrations to remove leaders, especially dictators, can have wide-ranging negative repercussions unimagined by those who experience the euphoria of the dictator's departure. All the more so if the groundwork has not been laid for a stable future. So we've witnessed in Egypt an even stronger military than before, controlling the political machinations of the state, imposing stricter censorship and fewer freedoms on Egypt and on the population, perhaps even stricter controls than existed under Mubarak. We have witnessed in Ukraine the emergence of a country divided and very much on the brink of civil war, if not already there. We've witnessed a major civil war in Syria with the resultant millions of refugees and ramifications for the entire Middle East and the world. The mass demonstrations that aim to remove leaders in these countries and in other countries implicitly accepted the inappropriate model that power emanates from the top of the pyramid. Now, I call that model inappropriate because it's inappropriate if what you're engaged in is nonviolent civil resistance. People seem to believe that if they just remove the leader at the top, this would at least be the beginning of the end to their oppression. But that goes against the very model that's the basis for nonviolent political action. Mass demonstrations can be one way of helping a population overcome fear, but such notions move the focus away from change at the bottom of the pyramid, change that is critical to long-term success. So the logical implications of such an approach, which has been common in the last 15 years, I think are these. First, mass demonstrations to remove leaders contributes to an understanding of success that is too narrow. Why? Because success should not be measured by whether or not one has a particular leader at a particular time. Success needs to be measured in longer terms. How is the country's infrastructure? How are the country's institutions functioning? What's the degree of freedom in the country? Who controls the infrastructure? Who controls the economy? Who controls the institutions? And how are they controlled? Second, civil resistance is itself too narrow a concept for meaningful change. Political action is not always resistance. And I'd like to say more perhaps during the question and answer period about how the concept of resistance itself may interfere somewhat with strategy for nonviolent social change. Sometimes, as Gene Sharp himself points out, political action, nonviolent political action, comprises many other more mundane activities. Gandhi's constructive programs are a major case in point. Lobbying, publishing, performing arts, the establishment of alternative institutions, these are all part of envisioning a promising future, part of constructing an alternative future. Simply bringing down a dictator may be insufficient to create that constructive future. Civil resistance can play a part in all of this, but sometimes perhaps not even a necessary part. When one watches the movie Gandhi, one is struck by the power of his actions of civil resistance. But when one reads his collective works, one is struck by how boring and how tedious so much of his work was. The same letters multiple times to multiple officials, the same talks multiple times to multiple audiences, sitting at his spinning wheel day after day, trying to build an alternative model for his society, praying every morning, praying every evening, setting a tone of humility and calm. This is the unglamorous grunt work, which Gandhi focused on far more than he did on mass demonstrations. Third, the understanding of massive civil resistance to overthrow dictators is tacitly subversive of democracy. It throws hundreds of thousands or sometimes millions of people into the streets. It invites a counter-response by those who feel their bread is buttered on the other side. So shall we have a demonstration by one side one day or 1 week or 1 month, followed by demonstrations by the other side for another day or another week or another month, and then let news commentators decide which demonstration has won? Or shall we, as Serbia did, demand a fair election, work for months and years to establish the institutions to ensure such an event, institutions that all sides could endorse? The key to understanding how or whether civil resistance can succeed long-term, how or whether civil resistance is a necessary part of social change, how or whether civil resistance subverts democracy, is also present in the works of Gene Sharp as his discussion of the social view of power. It has to do with obedience and conformity at the base of the pyramid. Obedience and conformity are two sides of the same coin. Obedience is the term sociologists or political scientists would use to describe behaviors by groups that conform to leaders' expectations. Conformity is the term that psychologists would use to describe the extent to which individuals identify with, internalize the values of, or fear leaders of movements, institutions, or states, for example. But in discussing fear and violence, one should not make the mistake of thinking that violence is primarily physical. And so oftentimes when people speak of nonviolent movements, they're thinking simply of movements that don't pick up guns or don't pick up stones. But violence is not merely killing another. It is violence when we use a sharp word, violence when we make a gesture to brush away a person, when we obey because there's fear. So violence isn't merely organized butchery in the name of God, in the name of society or country. Violence is much more subtle, much deeper. This, as you can see, is a quote from Krishnamurti, a man whom I knew little about until I happened to settle on a commune in Oregon back in 1970. I knew nothing about him at the time, and I left the commune within 3 days because it wasn't at all what I expected. But then years later I came to discover that Krishnamurti had much to teach, and he'd even visited the commune shortly after I'd left. One cannot be nonviolent if one is concerned with defeating another. As Krishnamurti says in this quote, when you call yourself an Indian or a Muslim or a Christian or a European or anything else, you are being violent because you are separating yourself from the rest of mankind. When you separate yourself by belief, by nationality, by tradition, it breeds violence. So a man who is seeking to understand violence does not belong to any country, to any religion, to any political party or partial system. He's concerned with the total understanding of mankind. And so what concerns me in part about the concept of civil resistance is that it has a tendency to pit one person against another and to think in divisive terms rather than in terms that unite. Ammon Hennessy, another person I admire greatly, a Christian anarchist, said, an anarchist is someone who doesn't need a policeman around to make him behave. And so when we talk about developing strength in the base of the pyramid, developing power in the base of the pyramid, the way you do that is by getting large numbers of people to identify with your values and not the values of the leaders, to internalize your values and not the values of the leaders, or to show how the actions of the leaders fly in the face of the values that have, at least that they give lip service to. And that's where the creativity in organizing comes about. Thus, the best way to gain, I may have missed a slide here, but let me see here. Yeah, thus the best way to gain power is by convincing others that their values are yours, that we are all in the same situation and seek the same means of extricating ourselves from that situation. Divide and conquer is indeed a form of violence, and nonviolent strategy must aim to bring people together, all people together. One does this by demonstrating that one seeks to build, not destroy, that one seeks to find common ground, not alienate, that one is willing to be harmed, but not to harm physically, emotionally, or psychologically, that one, in the words of Ammon Hennessy, doesn't need a policeman around to make him behave. One of the aspects of this is when you say that you're unwilling to harm another, but you're willing to be harmed, you remove some degree of fear from the opponent. The opponent feels less threatened. That allows the opponent to let their guard down. It also causes a greater empathy in people who sit on the fence, causes people who sit on the fence to side more with a person who demonstrably is unwilling to harm others and to side less with people who demonstrably are willing to harm others. But one has to conceive of harm not just in physical terms, but also in emotional and psychological terms. And when a group describes an opposing group as an enemy, that's a kind of psychological harm, and it's not the kind of attitude that generates internalization of values and identification with the grievance group itself. Gandhi's chief focus was always on self-change. This helps remove fear from all sides in a conflict. It develops a sense of self-sufficiency among the oppressed, and it minimizes the degree to which oppressors feel challenged. Gandhi's early and most important pamphlet was titled Hind Swaraj, which is often translated as Indian self-rule or Indian self-governance. The title is ambiguous, undoubtedly deliberately so on Gandhi's part, for Gandhi wished to appeal to the many Indians who wanted independence from British foreign domination. But his chief emphasis in the pamphlet was on self-reliance, on personal independence, and community self-sufficiency, on setting an example for others to follow, not on coercing others to follow. Gandhi's political actions always involved what he called a constructive program, a program in which people were taught to read, taught to farm, taught to spin, taught to manage sewage properly. He aimed at self-sufficiency. He did not seek to be given from the government or anyone what he and others needed. This is where nonviolent strategic action should begin and end. It sometimes entails civil resistance, but not always. The mass demonstrations would never be necessary if the populations made oppressive governments irrelevant. Open source software provides a good contemporary model of setting an example through self-sufficiency. So too do examples of going off the grid, which I'll talk about shortly. Going off the grid and open source software wrest power from corporations and place power in the hands of the people in a decentralized manner. In societies where power and the internet are controlled by government, they also wrest power from the hands of government. These actions preclude total control. They don't require the approval or sanction of others. Open source software exists in spite of and because of the oppressive nature of .com companies. It is inexpensive, often free, and thereby it's accessible to most people in the world. Many of you here today are familiar with Firefox, the browser, and a number of you are familiar with LibreOffice, the alternative to Microsoft Office, one of several alternatives, which is entirely compatible with Microsoft Office, and Thunderbird, an open source software email program. If you're unfamiliar with them, you should become familiar with them. Diaspora, another open source program which is facing difficulties, is an alternative to Facebook. And I want to thank Andreas Speck, whom I met through ICNC, for introducing me to LibreOffice and Diaspora. Going off the grid is another example by means of which people can work together to overcome oppression. And this is, in this instance, oppression by governments or large corporations. Increasingly, we've seen corporations renting or leasing services like cell phones to people, leasing these services rather than selling people the means by which we can provide our own services. Going off the grid is one way in which people can reduce their reliance on centralization and at the same time develop self-sufficiency, develop a decreasing dependence on the control of others. It's not a matter of changing those in control, of getting rid of, say, the head of GE or the head of Microsoft. It's a matter of eliminating the control that these companies exert over us, eliminating all control except self-control. If the focus of the resistance is aimed at removing the top part of the pyramid, then the focus is misplaced, for the institutional structures that supported the top will remain in place, and the system itself will not be changed. Thus, the focus initially and primarily should be aimed at self-change, as Gandhi maintained. If the focus becomes simply the removal of a leader from power, then nonviolence becomes not a normal mode of functioning for a given population, but simply another weapon in an arsenal aimed at victory by one side and defeat of the other. And we can talk a lot more, perhaps during the question and answer period, about how when you are thinking in terms of victory of your side and defeat of the other side, you're setting up a dynamic that is counterproductive to the strategy, to nonviolent strategy itself. If the focus becomes simply the removal of a leader from power, then an oppressed group implicitly accepts the model of power that led to their oppression in the first place. So at this point, I will halt the presentation and happy to turn to people to respond to comments and questions that you have, either by voice or by text. And I think, Jake, at this point, you'll be helping me out here, yes?
Yes, Barry, thank you. Yeah, very interesting presentation. It's the subject here you're talking about is something that we've not talked about very much before in terms of this sort of, it's a very different sort of model of looking at civil resistance and building this sort of nonviolent movement over a longer period of time using self-reliance. So good to hear that from you. So
well, I'm glad that you let me present it. When I put the proposal forward, I wondered whether you would. So I'm glad that you're open to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So yeah, as Barry mentioned, we can start with the Q&A portion now. I see a few questions right now, more about some logistics, but if you want to type your questions into the question panel, you can do so, and I will read them to Barry for you. And you can also use the raise hand button to show that you want to speak, and I can unmute you right now. So I'll just give everyone a few seconds to formulate some questions. one of the things I suppose while everyone's thinking of what they want to ask, Barry, one of the quotes that you said was that sort of seemed to sum up everything, is that mass demonstrations are not necessary if a movement can make an oppressive government irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was really interesting. Maybe do you want to talk a little bit more about that? And are there any particular cases you can think of where that really illustrate this point and can kind of go ahead?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can give you cases that illustrate the point successfully, but I can talk about what Gandhi was interested in. Gandhi focused on the villages in India. The cities he saw as a problem, and he thought the villages were a solution for India. And he thought that if people could become self-sufficient in the villages, people might even leave the cities, return to the villages, produce their own food, produce their own clothing, have self-sufficiency, and control their villages from within their villages. That's the kind of self-sufficiency that Gandhi was really interested in. It didn't happen. It's one of the reasons he thought he had failed at the end of his life in succeeding at what he wanted to succeed at. The models that I gave are really the models of open source software and going off the grid are, unfortunately for people in very poor and oppressed countries, models that won't help them so much. I acknowledge that. They might help them develop self-sufficiency. If I can go back here a slide or two, this slide I'm going off the grid, you'll see the slide in the top right, and there's a little boy in the corner. This was actually taken in Bangladesh, which I visited in 1998. And this was a solar farm in Bangladesh where a number of people in a poor community in Bangladesh were attempting to develop their own electric power and farm with it. The slide in the lower left corner is a picture of a woman spinning, obviously, but this was a woman I met from another village where they were spinning and then weaving and selling the silk that they wove, and actually forming the silk that they wove into different garments, a couple of which I bought when I was there, in an attempt for their village to become self-sufficient in Bangladesh. So those are some examples that I can give.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I have a really quick follow-up to that, and I see we have some people with their hands up. David Hartzell, you'll be up next, I think. Just in terms of power dynamics, what do you think that this kind of self-sufficiency does that might make it successful, with this kind of power balance between a movement and, some kind of people at the top who might either be oppressive or, again, working against this movement?
Sure. So here's the difference. If you're doing something to promote your self-sufficiency, it's not directly aimed at removing someone from power. It's indirectly aimed at that, but it's not even necessarily deliberately aimed at that. It's simply aimed at developing one's own freedom through self-sufficiency. That's a threat to people in power if you use the corporate model. And one of the things going on now with people going off the grid, the energy companies in the United States are trying to extract a fee for people who go off the grid. And when they do that, they are perceived by the mass of the population as just being greedy corporations. They're not providing any services, but they want money because someone is doing something as an alternative to what they're doing that doesn't require what they've got. So the powers that be who are oppressive feel threatened by it, but they can't point a finger and say, oh, you're doing this to hurt me, because it's quite clear it's not being done to hurt anyone. So that strengthens the power base of the people at the bottom and weakens the power base of those at the top, unless those at the top agree to go along with it. So as I'm fond of saying, but a lot of people don't like to hear me say this, it's a do as I wish or make me suffer. And that's what energy companies are starting to do now. They're either going along, for example, with solar power, or they're trying to charge people for for switching to it, even when they're not providing a service. And all that does is diminish the legitimacy of the authority of the power companies.
Thank you. Okay, we have David Hartsoe right now. Please go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Barry, again, for a very interesting and challenging presentation.
Yeah, hi, David.
I was wondering it would be helpful perhaps for all of us listening if you could just use the example of Egypt, for instance. If the people were interested in, which obviously they were, but with your insights and understanding, if they wanted to not just bring down Mubarak, but build a society that could protect itself against what has happened now. Just give some examples of what they might have done, and what others can do in the future.
Egypt is the country that first alerted me to the concerns that I'm raising in this presentation, and in my book, Violence and Nonviolence, which was published in 2013, but the last part of which was written in 2012, I was watching Egypt very carefully, and I predicted in that book that there were going to be problems in Egypt, and I predicted the sorts of problems that we're seeing right now. There were nonviolent movements in Egypt, but they were primarily, from what I know, and I'm not well versed in current Egyptian history, but from what I know, they were aimed at bringing down the leadership and bringing down the government. But I don't know that they were building up alternative institutions in Egypt. I don't know that they saw the military in Egypt as the source of the problem. They were focused on the personality of Mubarak, from what I can tell. And what needed to be done, and I hate to say this because I'm not a person living in a particularly oppressive country, living as I do in the United States. I'm fairly comfortable, so I don't like telling people who are uncomfortable what they ought to have done as such, because it's easy for me to talk about patience when I can still eat 3 meals a day and walk around safely and speak freely. But nonetheless, I think that if you look at Egypt right now, institutionally, it's not constructed any differently than it was under Mubarak. And so the removal of one leader, and even if we had a more benign leader right now, a more benevolent leader than the leader in Egypt, you'd still have the same institutional structures in place. And so I think that nonviolent civil resistance or nonviolent political strategy needs to focus at long-term institutional change and focus on what you want the future to be, not in terms of the top of the pyramid, but in terms of the bottom of the pyramid. I don't know if that helps at all, David.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, David. We have a few more questions here. Kate wants to know, what is the best way to convey to students or young people in general that there might be a problem with focusing on those in power as what you said, the enemy that needs to be conquered? In other words, focusing on the idea of resistance as a battle with the other as opposed to some of the points that you were making earlier.
I don't think it's an easy thing to rid oneself of the idea that someone else is one's own problem. I mean, I do that in my personal life all the time. Instead of looking to myself, I look at someone else as the source of my woes and so forth. And so I think that's a very difficult habit for human beings in general to get out of. But I think that's where Gandhi was most concerned about nonviolence. He talks about, in the film, he mentions the only devils running around are the devils inside of our own souls or inside of our own hearts. So I think to the extent that one looks to fashion one's own future rather than looking to someone else to fashion it for them, and that requires a great deal of patience, which again, as I said, I don't like to preach to people who are in oppressive situations. But I think it's a much more longer-term struggle than that of simply chopping off the top of that pyramid. So I'm approaching, in some respects, the end of my life. I'm 66 years old right now, and I recall, too readily when I was 20 or 30, thinking that I could change the world. And I think at my age now, I probably can't because I don't have enough time. But what I would say to young people and students is, you do have enough time, and the leader doesn't have to go next year because there's a future to build, and the future takes years and decades. So in some respects, young people have a lot more hope than people say my age.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Jean. So Jean says that she really likes your model, and as Jean moves towards self-sufficiency, she's wondering what, she said she feels like a citizen of what sometimes feels like a warmongering USA and may not appreciate what the country does in her name. So the question is, should she continue to work on her small self-management efforts or small community organizing efforts when at the same time, she feels the call to push at the top, especially, looking at those opinion leaders which a lot of people listen to and follow?
So I'm a professor by profession. I teach at a university, and I have become convinced over the years that I've been teaching that it's less the content of what I teach and more the manner in which I teach it that my students learn. If it's nonviolence I want to be teaching, then I need to be running a nonviolent classroom regardless of what I write on the blackboard or have them read. And so similarly, I think when Jean asks, should I be working on my own self-sufficiency or worrying about what's going on a larger scale, certainly one should be worried about what's going on a larger scale, but I think the power of example is far more powerful in the long run than simply, again, chopping off the top of that pyramid. I think that a desire to change the world is far better manifested, as Gandhi said, in a desire to change oneself and set an example by working with others. So I'd worry a little less about the larger picture and more about the smaller picture, which isn't to say let go of the larger picture. Let me give you an example. We had in the United States a few years ago the, I can't believe I'm forgetting the name of it now, but the movement that started, the Occupy movement. And I remember sitting with some people from ICNC about 6 months before the movement started. And my remark was, there's a problem with the peace movement in the U.S., a problem with the movement that wants to make the U.S. a less warmongering nation. And the problem is, we always think in terms of bringing 1 million people to Washington for a demonstration, but it would be far more powerful if each community organized its own long-standing demonstration, because something that could be replicated. You get a national movement not by bringing people from all over the nation to one city, but by having people in little communities all over the nation doing something similar. That's a national movement, and it's a far more potent national movement because everybody knows everybody in the small community. It's closely knit, and it can be replicated elsewhere. And indeed, that's what happened with Occupy. And I think the only reason Occupy was less successful is because the communities were not united across the nation in what their aims and goals were. But the fact that it was being replicated is what made it a national movement, not the fact that there was a concentrated movement of leaders at the top bringing 2 million people to New York City or 1 million people to Washington.
Thanks. I have a follow-up question on that, but yeah. I'll let someone else ask you a question. So Hauke, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Hauke Z, you can ask your question now.
I'd also sent a written question because I wasn't sure if my microphone is working. But I was looking at this self-reliance model that you just talked about, and I see the I don't want to say flaw because that sounds a bit harsh, but I just with my background coming from South Africa, there was a strong focus on persuading the leadership to begin working against the whole idea of racism and oppression, and the focus was there to try and change the leadership, change the system, and this was actually rather successful. And I'm just trying to put the idea of self-reliance into that context, and it would have been very difficult to everything, the electricity, the water, the different sources, and basically
Hauke, we're having a hard time hearing you. Could you try speaking a little bit louder?
Okay, can you hear me now? Is it better?
A little bit. Yeah, try speaking directly into the mic.
Okay, I'm calling from Germany. That might be the problem. So yeah, I just thought the self-reliance idea doesn't exactly work in every context, especially if oppression is developed to the point that self-reliant because they control so great by the government that its systems cannot get out of them. The husband, where water and electricity is controlled by the government. Israel and there's no way getting out of that system. And I'm wondering if this model actually works.
Hauke, we have to cut you off because we can't hear you, but if you could type in some of the questions.
Jake, I did pick up some of what he was asking and can speak to that, and then if he wants to type more, if I don't speak to all of it, you're certainly welcome to do that.
Yeah.
Is that all right, Jake?
Yeah, so we heard a bit about the self-reliance and oppression, but if you could just type in some of the questions, some of the additional comments and questions you had. We just couldn't hear you over the microphone, unfortunately. So
what I did hear him ask about was in South Africa, he's skeptical that the self-sufficiency that I'm talking about would have succeeded, that you really did need to aim at the power at the top, something to that effect. And the only response I would make, I'd make a couple of responses. One, Gene Sharp talks in his 1973 book, The Politics of Nonviolent Action, of the importance of recognizing the need for different kinds of tactics in different situations. And the more oppressive a government, the less you can directly challenge them. And the more one is dependent upon a centralized government, the more difficult it is to develop self-sufficiency. I don't want to pretend that those concerns aren't real. But I would say that much of, if I understand correctly what happened in South Africa, I'm thinking especially of the 1980s, where funeral processions, because of oppressive tactics of the South African police, became a common occurrence, and they became a common occurrence across communities. Again, this notion of replication as in Occupy, these funeral processions turned into demonstrations of solidarity against the police and against the South African government. They helped eliminate a climate of fear among the black South African population. So, and I would say this too, if you look at the African National Congress, which turned violent following Sharpsville in its efforts to overthrow the South African government, they really became successful when they turned to nonviolence in the 1980s. And not when they turned to their guerrilla movement, which was highly unsuccessful in the late 60s and throughout the 70s. That probably doesn't address sufficiently all the questions, but we can see if there are more coming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the question was, is the self-reliance model possible in all contexts, especially in the case where oppression is extended to the point where it might not be possible? But I think you kind of addressed that.
Yeah, and I'd just say that then you have to start on a smaller scale. Otherwise, if you resort to more radical means, along the lines of Frantz Fanon or something like that, to fight an oppressive regime, you are again buying into the same model of power at the top, and you're not creating a notion of a democratic model at the bottom.
Great, thanks.
Again, I would just add, I hate to be preaching to people who suffer under these conditions.
Mm-hmm. So there's no hands right now, but I did have one more follow-up, and if anyone has, maybe we have time for one or two more questions. So one of the measures of success that you mentioned near the beginning of the presentation was looking at whether institutions, the people, not necessarily the people, but the way institutions behaved and who they were serving, whether that changed after movement had occurred. So I'm wondering, is there a step between this community organizing for self-reliance from there to looking at these institutions? Is there a step in between having these institutions start to change and start to work more for societal good as opposed to working towards the good of elites or the people at the top? What is there an intermediate step basically between those two?
You mean between self-sufficiency and a change of government?
Yes.
Well, Sharp talks about alternative governments, which is, and one way to do that is to build these alternative institutions. To some extent, this was going on, I hope I have the country right, I think it was in Kosovo, where there was a parallel government set up that was sort of shut out of the Dayton Peace Accords, unfortunately. But there had been an alternative government set up that had a lot of promise. One way for communities to do this is to start with schools and build from there. The schools can be a good place to begin building an alternative governmental model. I don't know how well that addresses your question, Jake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, okay, we have our next person, Ilsa. Ilsa, go ahead. I've just unmuted you. Ilsa, are you there? Yeah, so she's typing to me. She's looking for, it's in the chat bar. Let's try another one then right now.
Okay.
So Bach wants to know more about the constructive programs that you were talking about. Can this take place in the forms of lobbying, party building, art? And is this something that can be done remotely, say if you're outside of the country where the movement might be taking place?
I may have to beg off on answering that one. I haven't thought about how it could be done remotely, but I can point to the example of the Black Panthers in the United States and also the example of Hamas in the occupied territories in Israel and Palestine. They were building programs of feeding the kids, working with the kids after school. I don't know how you could organize those things from a distance. I suppose they can be organized from a distance, but they can't easily be delivered from a distance. There still have to be people in place on the ground to carry them out. But those are relatively unthreatening activities to any power structure, except that they build a power base among the organizations that carry them out. To the point, of course, where the Black Panthers were targeted by the federal government and Hamas has been targeted for various reasons by Israel, of course.
Okay, great. So we're just about out of time. We have a few questions that were left over that we will be sending to Professor Gan that he will hopefully have a chance to address, and then we'll send that and add it to our website. And yes, we will be sharing the PowerPoint with everybody as well as the recording of this presentation. So if you joined us late, you can go back to the beginning and watch it from there. And everyone, thank you for joining us. And Barry, do you have any closing statements or anything else you wanted to mention before we wrap up?
Oh, just something of a more personal note. I noticed from the names here a number of people online that I haven't seen in years that I won't mention them by name, but I want to thank them for joining in. I hope they're all doing well. It's a pleasure to see them here, and pleasure to see the rest of you here whom I don't know. I hope I'll get to know you in the future. I welcome any questions or comments you have, and I'll be glad to reply to you.
Great. And thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and Barry, for your presentation. Very, very interesting to hear. And we will let everybody know when the recording has been posted on our website. And if you look at the page, there's actually quite a few more resources that we listed there. some books by Barry, as well as a collection of writings by Gandhi. So you can look at some of the things that Barry was talking about during his presentation with this constructive aspect of building a movement. So please do look at those and send any follow-up questions you may have to us at webinar@nonviolent-conflict.org. And we have a few more webinars coming up in the next few weeks, which we will let you all know about. So Barry, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you everyone, and we hope to see you soon.